Filipinos are the second largest ethnic group on Guam today and are interwoven in every part of our island society. But their presence is not new. It's the result of a long, complicated, and often tense history that stretches across centuries of colonialism, war, migration, and survival under the flags of Spain, Japan, and the United States. Chamorro and Filipino lives were shaped under these colonial powers, often in intertwined and contradictory ways. Guahusi Pulan, and we will explore that history from the earliest shipwrecked Filipinos to the present-day diaspora, examining how Filipinos came to Guam, what roles they played under colonial and military rule, and how their presence impacted and was impacted by the indigenous Chamorro people. This story is guided in large part by the amazing scholarship of Filipino historian from Guam, Kristin Oberiano. The first recorded Filipino presence on Guam can be traced to the 1600s, during the height of the Spanish galleon trade. In 1638, a mutiny aboard the Nuestra Señora de la Concepcion led to a shipwreck off the Marianas. Some of the surviving crew, including Filipinos, were marooned and eventually settled in Guam, marrying Chamorros and raising families. These early settlers blended into Chamorro society, a reminder that even from the beginning, Filipino and Chamorro lives have been interconnected. Since the Philippines was under Spanish rule, many Filipinos were brought to the Marianas as soldiers and laborers during Spain's conquest of the islands in the late 1600s. Following the conquest, Guam also became a penal colony beginning in the 1850s. Filipino convicts were sent to the island as a labor force alongside revolutionaries and political prisoners exiled for resisting Spanish colonial authority. Many of these revolutionary and political exiles were involved in major uprisings and nationalist movements in the Philippines, such as the 1872 Cavite Mutiny and the 1896 Philippine Revolution. Among the revolutionary and political exiles were a small number of well-educated upper-class Filipinos, whose arrival introduced new political ideas and cultural influences to Guam. While technically prisoners, many of them interacted with Chamorros, especially the elites, formed families, and occasionally integrated into village life. These Filipino elites were generally respected by both Chamorros and the Spanish administration due to their education and administrative skills. In contrast, the ordinary Filipino exiles were often viewed less favorably, seen as uneducated, violent troublemakers. Strong anti-Spanish sentiment among the exiled Filipinos sometimes erupted into violence. One particularly brutal incident involved an attempted mass escape by over 200 Filipino prisoners from the 1896 revolution. During the escape, approximately 80 were killed by panicked Chamorro guards. The intense political climate brought on by the exile of these revolutionaries may have also influenced Chamorro resistance. For instance, in 1884, a Chamorro named Jose de Salas assassinated the Spanish governor, an act some believe may have been inspired by or connected to Filipino revolutionary influence. Spanish records show that some of these exiles worked in administrative or labor positions under the colonial government on Guam. Their presence helped to create early connections between Chamorros and Filipinos, connections that were marked by shared colonial subjugation but also shaped by differing positions within the empire. Under Spain, both Chamorros and Filipinos were colonized subjects, but the relationship was complex. Filipinos were both colonized and sometimes positioned as agents of empire, such as soldiers, clerks, and laborers, brought in to serve colonial aims. These dynamics laid the foundation for future tensions, a dual role that would carry forward into later eras of U.S. rule. The results of the Spanish-American War brought both Guam and the Philippines under American control. When the U.S. invaded Guam in 1898, it inherited Spain's imperial footprint, but added a stronger racialized and militarized dimension. From 1899 to 1950, aside from the Japanese occupation from 1941 to 1944, Guam was governed by the U.S. Navy. During the pre-war period of American naval rule, the Filipino presence on the island steadily increased. The Navy, echoing earlier Spanish practices, began using Guam as a place of exile for Filipino revolutionaries considered dangerous to U.S. interests, reinforcing the island's role as a strategic outpost and site of political containment. One of the most notable was Apolinario Mabini, a key leader of the Philippine Revolution. Exiled to Guam in 1901 by the U.S., Mabini's time on Guam from 1901 to 1903 marked a pivotal moment in Filipino-Chamorro interaction. Although physically disabled, Mabini was intellectually active and engaged in conversations with Chamorros in Hagåtña. These exchanges offered an early glimpse of anti-colonial solidarity between colonized peoples. Mabini expressed sympathy for Chamorro cultural erasure under U.S. rule and recognized their shared status as subjects of empire. Other Filipino revolutionary exiles, such as Leon Flores and Pancracio Puti'on, chose to make Guam their permanent home. Both were highly educated lawyers, fluent in Spanish and well-versed in Spain's colonial administration, qualities that enabled them to assume prominent roles under the new U.S. naval government. Through marriage into Chamorro families, they contributed to the growth of the island's small but rooted Filipino community. However, not all exiles integrated into the American system. General Artemio Vibora Ricarte, a prominent figure in the Philippine Revolution, refused to swear allegiance to the U.S. In fact, Ricarte encouraged other Filipinos on Guam to rise up against U.S. rule, marking a sharp contrast to those who accommodated and served under the new colonial administration. In 1926, a member of the Philippine Congress proposed that Guam be annexed to the Philippines. This triggered a strong reaction from Chamorro leaders like Aguero Johnson, who argued that Chamorros were a distinct people with their own culture, land ties, and political goals. Their resistance was part of a larger racial and political debate over belonging and control in U.S. empire. This is also when we start seeing the U.S. legal mechanisms used to control land and identity. In 1933, those considered aliens, such as Filipino men married to Chamorro women, were denied land rights under alien land laws. Despite decades of residence and serving the U.S. naval administration, Filipino men like Leon Flores and Pancracio Puti'on were ordered to forfeit their land, which affected not just them, but their Chamorro families. What's important to remember is that Filipino and Chamorro identities were being shaped in different ways. Chamorros were fighting for political rights and land restitution. Filipinos were generally framed as migrant laborers or exiles, and later, cheap imported workers. Up until this point, Filipino migration to Guam had been relatively small in scale. Many earlier arrivals assimilated into Chamorro society, often through intermarriage, with their descendants identifying as Chamorro. However, this pattern shifted dramatically after World War II. The devastation of the Japanese occupation, coupled with the near total destruction of Guam's villages, was followed by a sweeping U.S. military reconstruction effort. This period redefined Guam's demographic, political, and economic landscape. To transform Guam into a military stronghold, the U.S. needed a massive labor force, and that labor came from the newly independent Philippines. By the late 1940s, approximately 28,000 Filipinos migrated to Guam, alongside 7,000 white Americans, primarily for military-related work. This marked the largest wave of Filipino migration in Guam's history, far exceeding earlier, more gradual, and assimilative movements. It illustrated the duality of Filipino presence, as both a product of military expansion and a contributor to local development. These workers were recruited by American companies such as Brown Pacific Maxon and Luzon Stevedoring Company, which often hired skilled and unskilled laborers with prior experience working on U.S. bases in the Philippines. Filipino workers were critical in rebuilding Guam's infrastructure: roads, runways, housing, and military facilities. In many ways, they laid the literal groundwork for Guam's transformation into what the U.S. called the tip of the spear, a forward base of operations in the Pacific. Despite their essential role, Filipino laborers faced harsh and unequal conditions, underpaid compared to white American workers, housed in segregated camps such as the well-known Camp Rojas in Agate, restricted in mobility, subject to curfews, surveillance, and pass systems. Camp Rojas housed thousands in crowded quarters and operated more like a carceral labor site than a civilian workplace. These conditions reflected a rigid racial labor hierarchy. White Americans occupied upper-tier roles and received the highest wages. Filipinos formed the exploited bulk of the labor force, subjected to control and discipline. Chamorros, despite being indigenous to the island, were often overlooked for employment. Military officials and contractors frequently labeled them lazy or unskilled, echoing earlier racist stereotypes. These perceptions were not based on actual work ethic or skill, but were rooted in racialized colonial narratives that structured Guam's labor economy in service of colonialism. The dual processes of Chamorro land loss and Filipino labor importation created fertile ground for ethnic tension. Over one-third of Guam's land was seized by the U.S. military, displacing Chamorro families from ancestral homes and severing access to agricultural lands. As Chamorros struggled with resettlement, limited compensation, and loss of autonomy, thousands of Filipino workers were arriving and building new lives on the island. While many Filipinos eventually left after their contracts ended, a significant number stayed, married Chamorros, and formed distinct communities. This coincided with broader demographic shifts. Chamorros, who made up about 90% of Guam's population in 1940, had dropped to less than half by 1950. These changes introduced new dynamics. Chamorros often viewed Filipinos as economic competitors and beneficiaries of a system that marginalized the indigenous population. Filipinos, while valued for their labor, faced discrimination from both U.S. authorities and segments of the local population. They were navigating a colonial landscape that both welcomed and exploited them. Notable labor demand wasn't confined to the military. Since the 1950s, the government of Guam itself actively recruited Filipino professionals for civilian roles across key sectors, including education, healthcare, construction and engineering, service industries. Filipino nurses, teachers, doctors, engineers, and technicians became vital to Guam's post-war reconstruction and modernization. Their contributions extended beyond manual labor. They were pivotal in shaping Guam's institutional and social development. As Cold War tensions escalated, Guam's strategic importance increased, and so did the demand for labor. After changes to Guam's immigration and security clearance laws in the 1960s, Filipinos could migrate to the island largely independently of military employment. Through chain migration, families already on island sponsored relatives, expanding the Filipino community even further. Some migrated onward to the States, while others made Guam their permanent home. By the 1960s and 70s, new Filipino immigrants were entering an island that already had a well-established Filipino presence. Many of the first-generation Filipino migrants, particularly those who had arrived post-World War II through military labor contracts or civilian recruitment, have begun laying down roots. These migrants often maintained strong connections to their home provinces and spoke Philippine languages, and they created civic and cultural organizations to preserve their regional identities and support one another. These included Filipino Community of Guam, Filipino Ladies Association of Guam, regional specific groups such as Bicol Club of Guam, Cavite Association of Guam, Visayan Association of Guam, Ilocano Association of Guam, Aklan Association of Guam. These organizations reflected the Philippines' own regional diversity. Rather than adopting a singular, homogenized Filipino identity, migrants maintained distinct provincial affiliations, languages, and customs while adapting to life on Guam. The children of these first-generation migrants, second-generation Filipinos, grew up in Guam's multicultural environment. They often straddled two worlds, raised with Filipino traditions at home, while being socialized in Guam schools and neighborhoods alongside Chamorro and other ethnic peers. This generation tended to be English-speaking, culturally hybrid, and embedded in Guam's social fabric. Some identified as Filipino, others as Guamanian, and many questioned where exactly they fit in. By the 1970s, the Filipino community had grown so significantly that Chamorro politicians began courting the Filipino vote in local elections. Some candidates even publicly emphasized Filipino ancestry from generations past to appeal to voters. Yet, alongside growing integration came rising tension. Many Chamorros expressed concern about cultural and political marginalization, especially as demographic trends showed a declining Chamorro population on island. The growth of the Filipino population became a source of anxiety for some Chamorros who feared being displaced politically, culturally, and economically. Tensions emerged in everyday life, ethnic clashes in schools and neighborhoods, underlying frustrations rooted not merely in prejudice, but in decades of U.S. colonial policy that positioned Filipino migrants and local Chamorros in competition for land, jobs, resources, and political recognition. By the latter half of the 20th century, Guam was actively promoted as a model of American multiculturalism. Filipino civic organizations like the Filipino Community of Guam thrived. Parades, festivals, and beauty pageants celebrated Filipino heritage alongside Chamorro, Japanese, Korean, and other cultural traditions. These events and civic displays were largely organized by first-generation migrants who maintained strong cultural ties to their Philippine hometowns and organized community life around regional identities. However, many of their children, second-generation Filipinos, experience multiculturalism differently. Raised in Guam's U.S.-style school system, Filipinos could understand their parents' regional Philippine languages but had limited speaking ability. They often navigated a complex sense of in-betweenness, feeling not quite Filipino enough for their parents' generation, yet never fully accepted as islanders on Guam. Yet this surface-level harmony masked deeper inequities. While Filipino immigrants were often praised for their industriousness and integration, Chamorros continued to struggle with unresolved land return from U.S. military takings, cultural and language loss due to Americanization, political disenfranchisement, and lack of self-determination. For some Chamorro thinkers and activists, multiculturalism became a double-edged sword, used to promote unity but also to obscure Chamorro-specific claims to land, sovereignty, and cultural survival. In this framework, multiculturalism could unintentionally flatten historical differences, treating all ethnic groups as equally situated, despite the fact that only Chamorros are indigenous to the island and have faced centuries of colonial erasure. In the 1980s, a renaissance of Chamorro activism emerged. Groups like Organization of People for Indigenous Rights began asserting that only the indigenous Chamorro people should have the right to decide Guam's political status through a self-determination process. This movement was grounded in a long history of dispossession and injustice, from Spanish reduction to U.S. land takings after World War II. Filipino responses to Chamorro self-determination were mixed. Some enthusiastically supported the movement, identifying parallels with the Philippines' own history of colonialism and fight for self-determination. However, others questioned the fairness of excluding non-Chamorros, especially those born and raised on Guam who considered the island their home. This sparked open debate. Many Filipino residents ask, if I've lived here all my life, if I've raised my children here, why should I be excluded from decisions about Guam's political future? Chamorro activists responded by clarifying that self-determination was not about exclusion or ethnic supremacy. Rather, it was about rectifying historical injustices and recognizing Chamorro's unique status as an indigenous people colonized multiple times over. Still, the conversations raise complex questions. What defines belonging? Can citizenship override indigenous rights? How do we balance pluralism with indigenous justice? These unresolved tensions between indigeneity, migration, and identity continue to shape the social and political fabric of Guam today. Today, Filipinos are well rooted in Guam society. Many have Chamorro spouses and children, contribute meaningfully to the local economy, serve as community leaders, and actively participate in island life. Their tremendous cultural impact is also undeniable, seen in everything from food and language to religious practices, art, festivals, and community organizations. In some areas, Filipinos even tend to experience better social outcomes than Chamorros. For example, Filipinos are more likely to be college educated than Chamorros. By this point, Guam is home to multiple generations of Filipinos, each shaped by different migration conditions, social relationships with Chamorros, and levels of integration. The first generation, largely arriving post-World War II through military construction or in the 1950s to 70s through civilian labor recruitment or chain migration, laid the foundation for the Filipino community. They maintained strong ties to their provincial identities, spoke their Philippine languages, and formed region-specific clubs that still exist today. The second generation, the children of these early migrants, grew up navigating life in Guam's multicultural and indigenous Chamorro society, more fluent in English than in their parents' native languages. While some retained strong Filipino cultural ties, many were also shaped by American schooling, Chamorro classmates, and Guam's colonial context. They often had to negotiate questions of identity. Am I Filipino? Am I Guamanian? Where do I belong? Now, a third and even fourth generation has come of age. Born and raised entirely on Guam, many of these Filipinos consider Guam their only home. Some identify strongly with Filipino heritage, others as Guamanian, and still others reject such binary categories altogether. Often English dominant with less fluency in Philippine languages, these Filipinos are just as embedded in Guam's social fabric as Chamorros and are part of the story of multicultural integration, though not without continued tensions about identity, indigeneity, and belonging, some experiencing a sense of cultural disconnection from their Filipino roots, prompt some of them to reclaim Filipino identity. While ethnic tensions between Chamorros and Filipinos were more pronounced in the past, especially during earlier periods of rapid migration and militarization, these tensions have eased significantly in recent decades. Intermarriage, cultural exchange, and shared experiences under colonial rule have helped foster a deeper understanding between the two communities. It's crucial to remember that Filipinos are not outsiders in this history, but they are not indigenous either. They arrived in large numbers through systems of empires, such as political exiles in both Spain and America, and as laborers for American military expansion. Filipino contributions are undeniable, but so too are the structural inequalities that made their migration possible. Understanding this history requires nuance. To use a concept by historian Dean Sarnelio, we must explore Chamorro-Filipino relations in complex unity, neither romanticizing solidarity nor assuming constant opposition. Colonialism didn't just take land and labor, it shaped identities, communities, and conflicts in lasting ways. The ethnic tension between Chamorros and Filipinos wasn't rooted in ethnicity alone, but in structural conditions that pitted the indigenous Chamorros against Filipino migrants for land, jobs, and recognition, all under U.S. management. In the end, the history of Filipinos on Guam is one of shared pain, layered solidarity, colonial contradiction, and resilience. Filipinos were both colonized and sometimes positioned as agents of empire, serving as soldiers, clerks, and laborers under Spanish and American regimes. This dual role laid the foundation for both tension and alliance. It is a complicated but necessary story, one that helps us better understand not only the past, but how Chamorros and Filipinos imagine identity, belonging, and justice on Guam today. If you liked and enjoyed the video, consider supporting me on Patreon so I can continue to produce more Pacific Studies content. Like this video, subscribe to the channel, turn on all notifications, follow me on social media at PulanSpeaks, and a special seduce Masi to Patreon supporters Puti'on, Dylan Sablan, Jesse Babauta, Athena-nike, Reyna, Taitingfong, Aguero, Kylon Eckert, Debina Cruz, Zachary Olivadese, and Jacob Allen. Seduce Masi for watching. Guahusi Pulan.